I've always been a bit of a photography enthusiast. Over the years, I'd accumulated a collection of cameras, some of which I no longer used. So, I decided to sell my old DSLR on Craigslist. It was a model that still fetched a decent price, and I thought the extra cash would be nice. After a week of the listing being up, I received a message from a guy named Mark. He seemed genuinely interested and wanted to inspect the camera in person. We agreed to meet at the Brew Corner, my favorite local coffee shop. People were always bustling, and I felt it was a safe choice. Mark was on time. He was tall, with a rugged appearance, scruffy beard, baseball cap pulled down, almost hiding his eyes. There was something intense about his gaze, but I brushed off the uneasy feeling, attributing it to the natural anxiety of meeting a stranger from the internet. We chatted about the camera, and he seemed knowledgeable. After a brief inspection, he handed over the cash, and we parted ways. I felt a sense of relief. The transaction had gone smoothly. However, that evening, I received a message from Mark. He claimed the camera had a defect and demanded a refund. I was taken aback. I knew the camera was in perfect condition when I'd handed it over. But to avoid any confrontation, I agreed to meet him again at the same coffee shop. The next day, as I walked into the Brew Corner, I noticed Mark was already there, but his attitude had changed. He looked more agitated, his eyes dotting around nervously. As I approached, he accused me of scamming him. His voice was raised, drawing the attention of a few patrons. I tried to calm him down, offering to refund his money just to defuse the situation. As I handed over the cash and took back the camera, I felt his grip on my wrist. It was firm, almost painful.
"You think you can fool me?"
he hissed. I tried to pull away, but he held on, his eyes filled with a menacing rage. Suddenly, a barista from behind the counter shouted,
"Hey, let go of her!"
Mark's grip momentarily loosened, giving me just enough time to pull away. But as I stumbled back, Mark lunged at me, knocking over a table in the process. The cafe erupted into chaos. People screamed, some trying to intervene, while others rushed to the exit. Two burly men, regulars I recognized from my frequent visits, tackled Mark to the ground, pinning him down. The weight of the situation began to sink in, and my legs felt weak. A kind woman guided me to a chair and offered me a glass of water. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens piercing the now silent cafe. They handcuffed Mark and began taking statements from the witnesses. As they led him out, he shot me one last nasty look, but I met his gaze with newfound strength. As the police led Mark away, Detective Ramirez approached me.
"We've been tracking this guy for a while,"
he said, his voice low.
"He's not just involved in aggressive altercations, he's suspected in a series of disappearances linked to online sales."
I felt a chill run down my spine. Disappearances? Ramirez nodded gravely.
"People who've met him for transactions and never returned home. We've never had enough evidence to hold him, and no bodies have been found. But we believe he's involved."
The weight of the revelation hit me. I had narrowly escaped a potentially fatal encounter. The cafe, once a place of comfort, now felt tainted by the shadow of Mark's intentions. A few days later, I received an anonymous package at my doorstep. Inside was my camera, smashed to pieces, and a note.
"You got lucky."
The handwriting was eerily familiar. It was Mark's. The police were alerted, and they increased patrols around my neighborhood. But despite their efforts, Mark was released due to a lack of evidence connecting him to the disappearances. Sleep became elusive. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside my window sent me into a panic. I installed security cameras and an alarm system, but the feeling of being watched never left. One evening, as I was reviewing the footage from my security cameras, I noticed something chilling. In the dead of night, a figure stood outside my window, just out of the camera's main focus, watching. The silhouette was unmistakably Mark's. I moved out of my apartment shortly after, leaving behind memories and the haunting presence of a predator. The police never caught Mark, and his shadow loomed over my life for years. The experience taught me the dangers lurking in the shadows of the online world. I became an advocate for online safety, sharing my story to warn others of the risks. But in the back of my mind, the knowledge that Mark was still out there, possibly watching, always lingered. We met at his house. His handshake was firm. He seemed solidly middle class. Modest home, basic decor, nothing flashy. A suburban bachelor pad. After our hellos, he asked if I'd like something to drink. His fridge was stocked with microbrews, good stuff. I grabbed a Dogfish Head 90, and he guided me to the basement.
That's where we'll be working,
he said. The basement was sparsely furnished. Most prominent was what looked like an old dentist's chair with a table next to it. The table was covered in a gray cloth. The man handed me an envelope he'd been carrying. $5,000.
You can have the rest when we're finished,
he told me.
It'll only be a few hours.
He sat in the chair. He gave me my instructions with a smile.
I want you to pull out all my teeth.
As he spoke, he pulled the cloth away. Underneath were gardening gloves, pliers, a ball-peen hammer, and a shoebox. Pull his teeth out? I asked him, and he confirmed that what I'd heard was, in fact, accurate.
No more questions. Now, just do whatever you need to do to get them out,
he ordered. With that, he sat back in the chair and opened his mouth. I'm not, and never have been, a dentist, but there he was. His mouth was wide open, exposing brilliantly white, healthy teeth. His gums were a soft pink, and his tongue seemed to be patiently waiting on the floor of his mouth. I fingered the money in the envelope and chugged the remainder of my beer.
You can run upstairs and get another one if you want,
he told me. I ran upstairs, as suggested. Staring at the dozens of beers, I tried to gather my thoughts. Long story short, I said, fuck it, grabbed as many as I could carry, and trudged back into the basement. After cracking open a bottle of Rasputin Imperial Stout, I approached the man, his mouth still available, and tentatively pressed on one of his front teeth. It was smooth and firmly anchored in his jaw. I sighed and put on the gloves. The feeling that came over me was one of resignation. I knew I would do what he asked, and I figured I could always leave with the 5,000s if it got any weirder. I picked up the pliers, which looked brand new and shiny, gripped the front tooth I'd poked. Applying careful pressure, I gently pulled back. It didn't budge. The man exhaled softly through his nose, and his eyes rolled. My next pull was fierce and quick. The tooth bent toward me with an audible crunching sound. Blood seeped from behind it. Still, it was lodged in his gums. Muttering under my breath, I squeezed the pliers as hard as possible and pulled with all my weight. The tooth came out, and I fell on my butt. Still holding the pliers, I stared at what I'd done. The tooth was white and gleaming, with an ugly, short root jutting from the top. I got up and looked at the man. Blood oozed from the hole in his gums. He sat calmly, arms crossed in apparent impatience. I loosened my grip on the pliers and let the tooth fall on the concrete floor. The remaining top front teeth went quickly enough now that I had an idea of what kind of work had to be done. Never once did the man make a sound aside from small changes in his breathing. When my hands were blocking his mouth, The blood was beginning to be a factor. It limited my grip, and I frequently had to ask him to spit it out. He just swallowed. After the top 6 teeth were gone, I was presented with a problem: molars. I decided to wait on those and go with the bottom row. The leverage was more accessible to them. I could put the pliers straight down on the tooth and yank back and downward. Those 6 went quickly. Again, the problem: molars. I drank a fat tire ale. I took the hammer and asked him to clench his remaining teeth together. Then, I pulled back his cheek as far as it would go without breaking the skin. I tapped the molars with the hammer. He sighed in annoyance. I swung. Teeth exploded in shards of enamel into his mouth. I took the pliers and yanked out what was left dangling. I repeated this on the other side. Then, all that was left were the wisdom teeth. The hammer trick worked on the top ones. I stood on the chair, reached in with the pliers, squeezed, and pulled. They came out with the sound of a shrub ripped from the ground, and then I was done. The man grinned at me, his mouth a crater-filled wreck. He drawled blood from the corners of his mouth. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out the other envelope and handed it to me. I thanked him and backed away. As I was counting it out, he reached into the shoebox on the table. When he opened it, my spine immediately started tingling. The box was filled with spiders. From the look of them, they were brown recluses. They skittered up his forearm, and he clenched a handful of them in his fist. Then he stuffed them in his mouth. I could see his jaw working as if he was chewing, which was now impossible because of the status of his teeth. He beckoned for me to come closer. I'd finished counting. He hadn't shot at me. I moved forward maybe an inch.
I like their little legs in the sockets. They tickle.
He choked out. I ran. After months of job hunting, the stress took its toll on me. Desperation led me to the lesser-known corners of the internet, including the job listings on Craigslist. Late one night, I stumbled upon an ad titled "Night Watchman Needed for Historic Property. Generous Pay." The job seemed straightforward, and the pay for such a position was surprisingly high. I immediately sent in my application. To my surprise, I received a response within the hour. The email was from a Mr. Thompson, who claimed to be the property's caretaker. He explained that the property had been in his family for generations, and that they needed someone to watch over it at night due to recent incidents of vandalism. He wanted to meet in person at the property for an interview the following evening. The property was on the outskirts of town, down a long, winding road surrounded by dense woods. The imposing structure loomed ahead as I approached, its Gothic architecture casting eerie shadows in the twilight. Mr. Thompson greeted me at the entrance, a tall man with pale skin and old-fashioned attire. His eyes, though friendly, had a distant, haunted look. The interview was brief. Mr. Thompson seemed more interested in gauging my courage than my qualifications. He spoke of the property's long history and hinted at past tragedies, but never delved into specifics. By the end, he offered me the job, handing me a set of old iron keys.
Never enter the West Wing,
He said, his voice grave.
and always lock yourself in the security room by midnight.
My first night was uneventful, though the vastness of the property and its echoing silence were unsettling. But as nights turned into weeks, strange things began to happen. I'd hear footsteps in the hallways, see shadows flit past windows, and occasionally, a distant, mournful wail would pierce the silence. One night, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to venture into the forbidden West Wing. The air grew colder as I approached, and a palpable sense of dread settled over me. The rooms were covered in thick dust, indicating that they hadn't been used in years. But in the last room, I found a series of old photographs. They depicted the property over the years, but one figure remained consistent in each. Mr. Thompson, unchanged, always with those distant, haunted eyes. As I delved deeper into the room, I found a journal, its pages yellowed with age. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who seemed to have been a previous tenant of the property. The entries started off normally, detailing daily life, but as the dates progressed, they became more frantic. Eleanor wrote of seeing apparitions, hearing whispers at night, and feeling an ever-present dread. Her last entry was particularly chilling.
He is not what he seems. The caretaker he watches waits. I fear I am his next victim.
Suddenly, the room grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. Turning around, I was met with the sight of Mr. Thompson. His eyes no longer friendly, but cold and menacing.
I told you not to enter the West Wing,
he whispered, his voice echoing eerily. I bolted from the room, hearing his laughter echoing behind me. I locked myself in the security room, heart pounding. The CCTV monitor showed Mr. Thompson wandering the halls, searching for me. Hours seemed to pass, and just as dawn began to break, he disappeared from view. I didn't wait for daylight. Grabbing my belongings, I fled the property, vowing never to return. But as I reached my car, I found a note on the windshield. It read,
"You can leave the property, but the property will never leave you."
Shaken, I drove away as fast as I could, trying to distance myself from that cursed place. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to resume a normal life. But every night, I'd hear the distant, mournful wail from my dreams, and shadows would flit past my windows. One evening, a news report caught my attention while trying to relax and watch TV. The headline read, "Historic property burns down. Cause unknown." The report showed the very property I had worked at, now reduced to ashes. The reporter mentioned that the fire had started in the West Wing and had quickly consumed the entire building. But what chilled me to the bone was the mention of a series of old photographs near the property, all depicting various people throughout the decades, with one consistent figure in the background: the caretaker. The report concluded with an interview with a local historian who mentioned an old legend about the property. It was said that the caretaker, Mr. Thompson, had made a pact with dark forces to protect the property in exchange for eternal servitude. Those who crossed him or tried to unveil the property's secrets would be haunted for life. I turned off the TV, my mind racing. The shadows and wails made sense now. I was haunted by the spirit of Mr. Thompson, bound to him by my curiosity and my trespass into the forbidden West Wing. Determined to free myself, I sought the help of a renowned paranormal expert. Together, we performed a series of rituals to sever Mr. Thompson's and me's bond. It was a grueling process, filled with terrifying visions and chilling encounters. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, I was free. The shadows and wails ceased, and I could finally find peace. But the memories of that cursed property and its eerie caretaker will forever remain etched in my mind.